Hey everybody, welcome back. Today we're going to be working on the Integra again. So I think I left off with just getting the engine in the engine bay, and today I want to go ahead and get some of the wiring done, and I want to get the cables installed on the transmission and just start buttoning everything up so I can at least get it started, get that first start going. Getting really close and I'm getting really excited, so let's go ahead and jump right in and see what we got going on today. Alright, so I got the cables bolted to the bracket here, and that's why I kind of like the Accord trans, because they just bolt. They don't have clips or anything. It seems easier to me. These cables are sticking up a little high in the engine bay here, so I think I'm going to go ahead and tuck them down. The reason I can't just push them down is the sway bar actually kind of pinches them in just a little bit, so I need to undo the sway bar a little just to be able to scoot them down. But I already verified that it does shift and everything. The shifter is still a little loose because I only got two right bolts in it, but as you can see, it goes in all the gears. So okay, so I've made some progress on the Integra. I have the charge harness done on this end, and I have the intake manifold back on and all the vacuum lines and everything plugged in. And this will be rerouted a little differently once everything's said and done, but for now this is where it's going to sit. This is the alternator cable, and it just runs right here to the fuse box to the alternator. And this one is for the starter, and it's going to run right here to the battery, because I am going to use the factory battery tray, just for now at least, because it'll just sit right there and it'll be easy. And I did manage to get the conversion harness through this opening here where the chassis harness came through, and it was a little bit of a struggle, but I just kept wiggling through, and I finally managed to get both of the plugs through. This plug and this plug into this chassis harness, and this end is the conversion harness. And as far as the harness goes and everything, that should be all I have to do, besides hardwiring some of the other lines that came loose with the conversion harness. Well, the engine harness is all plugged in, at least everything I need. There's a couple plugs in the transmission I'm not going to be using, like reverse lockout. And this has a VSS, so I'm going to wire that in later to the ECU. But for now, I won't have a speedometer. I also got the heater lines ran. I managed to just be able to trim down the factory K-series heater lines that go to it. And I believe this controls the hot and the cold, so I am going to try and track down one of the B-series cooler lines that has a little gate in it that this controls. But for now, it'll at least have heat. Another thing I found out is this is the hybrid racing. It's supposed to be for a K-swap. It's a throttle cable, and it was for a K-swap's Integra, but for whatever reason, this thing is about 2 or 3 inches short, and it's not going to end up being able to work. So I'm going to have to track down a throttle cable that's long enough for me to be able to use. Whether I have to use a factory B-series one, I'm not tripping about that. I just need to track one down so I can at least have a throttle for now. But yeah, for whatever reason, this one is not going to work. And here's the original battery tray that was in the car. I actually managed to find this in like a pile of junk. Somehow I ended up keeping this thing for a few years. I went ahead and scuffed it up, sanded it down a little bit, and I just threw some primer and then some paint on it, and then a little bit of clear. I'm going to let this dry overnight. Alright, so I've been working on some of the wiring for the Integra, and I have a charge harness that I made up, and there's 2 cables that run inside this loom. one cable goes to the alternator and one cable goes to the terminal in the starter. And then the alternator cable runs right up here to the fuse box, this terminal in the fuse box. And then the other cable for the starter runs right to the positive terminal on the battery. And then I have another cable that runs from the positive terminal on the battery, it's this one right here, to this terminal on the fuse box. And that's basically it for the charge harness. It's pretty simple. And then I just have a ground going to the chassis, and I'll redo this later, but for now it'll work. It's just a spare wire I had laying around. And for the grounds on the engine and transmission, I have this one, which is just temporary. I just put it there for now just so I could make sure everything's working, but I'll redo it later when I get more wire in. And then I have this one here, and this one goes from the chassis here to the transmission. And they're both 4 gauge. All the wiring I did for the batteries 4 gauge wiring. And then I actually got a fuel line made up. Now this is temporary as well because I'm going to be redoing the fuel line, getting a return fuel rail and a pressure regulator and a gauge and all that. But for now, just to get the car running, I have I think it's like 5/16 inner diameter fuel line, and I just put it right here to the rail, and I put a hose clamp. And then for this end, what I did is, this is the factory banjo line that came with the B series, and I just chopped it right here at right before the crimp. And then it was pretty difficult to get this line on here because this diameter on the outside is a little bigger than the inside diameter on this hose, but I was able to squeeze it on, and then I got a hose clamp on there, and as long as it doesn't have any leaks and the car runs, it's going to work for now. Kind of hard to see because it's dark in here, but this was the park neutral drive switch or whatever, and what I did was, just for now, just to make sure that it works and these are the right wires, I hooked these wires up together. I just watched some video on YouTube, and the guy had an 01 Integra just like mine, and he hooked these 2 wires up and it fired right up. So you can see I have power to the dash, and all this stuff works. Fan works, hazards work, everything works, window works. And you can see that it fires right up. Make sure I'm in neutral. Battery's getting a little low, but it does crank over, so I'm happy with that. All right, so here's how I'm gonna run no power steering pump. This is a power steering pump and AC delete for K-Series engine. And I picked this up from a buddy of mine. I traded him my AC compressor and my power steering pump because I wasn't going to need it. And he wanted to go back to power steering and AC. And so I just went ahead and I actually pulled this off his car for him. And it's going to just go somewhere like, let's see. It's just going to go in there, something like that, just like that, and then it'll allow me to run the belt. And it actually came with the belt, so I grabbed this as well because this is the exact length I need to have no AC. And so that came as a kit, and he gave it to me, or we traded. And I think I've figured out why the throttle cable didn't fit. I was down at Speed Factory today because I dropped off my ECU to have K-Pro installed, and I was talking to him about the throttle cable, and I guess the cable I got was a short cable from Hybrid Racing, and they make a long cable as well, and as you can see, it's a considerable amount longer, probably a good almost a good foot, maybe 9 inches or so. And you can see this is the long cable, so I would definitely before you order one, I mean, they're cheap, they're like 30 bucks, but before you order one, try and figure out which one you need, and that will save you a little bit of money. All right, so I got the power steering delete pulley on, and the belt's on, and it was a little bit tighter, I think, than normal, or it was harder to move this tensioner as far as it needed to go with this mount. So what I did is I actually got a serpentine belt tool, and they're really thin. I was able to slide between the mount and the pulleys there, and I was able to move it enough to get the belt on. And where I got the diagram for was off service data. And as you can see, this is the normal routing for the belt for this car, and I just deleted the AC pulley and I just routed the belt above the water pump, which is where it normally would have went anyway after it went around the AC. I just bypassed the AC, and that's how I got the belt on. So I pulled up wiring diagrams for an 01 Integra, and there's like 6 or 7 wires that I need to wire in, and there was no instructions that came with my harness, my conversion harness, but I've watched a few videos and I kind of get the idea that these wires need to wire into the factory ECU plugs. And for now, the only one I care about is fuel, because that's what's going to allow me to get it running. And this is, I believe, the pin that I'm going to need. This is on the A plug, and it's pin 16, and it goes to the fuel pump relay. And I'm pretty sure that's going to be the wire that I need to tap into. And I'm going to test first to make sure that actually has power going to it, going to the ECU. Or I'm going to test to see if I have power on the conversion harness at the fuel pump. And if so, then I'm going to plug it into this wire over here, and it should send power to my fuel pump relay. So I'm going to go ahead and do that and see if that works. All right, so I have been having a little bit of trouble getting this thing to run. I can get it to like fire up for a second, and then it just sputters out and dies. And I didn't wire in those wires from the conversion harness into the factory ECU plugs, but I did run power to the fuel pump and power to the engine coolant temp sensor, which is everything I need to get it to run. And that's when I was running into the issue. And I did already confirm that I have spark. I pulled the spark plug out and I grounded it, and it has spark. And I changed the crank sensor just in case that was the problem. And then I also pulled this line off just to confirm that I did have fuel, and I do have fuel coming out when I turn the pump on. So I knew it wasn't any of those issues, and I couldn't quite figure it out, and the battery is drained. Obviously, you see the jump box on there. So I had a buddy come look at it, and he basically said that one thing it's probably, or it could very well be, is there's no regulator on here. And these are a return system, and the regulator returns it back. And the pump is putting out too much pressure for the car. So when I did pull the spark plug out, it was soaked in fuel. So I'm not sure if that's the issue. Either way, I went ahead and ordered some eBay K-swap fuel kit. It's going to allow me to use the factory fuel filter, and it's going to have a pressure regulator and a gauge and all that. So I'm waiting for that to come. That should be here in a couple days, and then I'll be able to actually test it. In the meantime, I'm going to add a couple grounds just to verify that that's not the problem. And I also, as you can see, the fuel line is off here that I have it tucked down there to a bucket, and I'm going to go ahead and turn the fuel pump on, and I'm going to drain all the gas out. And I do have a couple gallons I'm going to put in of fresh gas just to eliminate that issue as well. And then I'm going to go ahead and start buttoning up some of the other stuff. So I'm going to get the bumper on, get the headlights turning on, maybe try and get these side skirts on. I do have these that were on the car when I bought it, and I took them off to be painted, and they've just been sitting around for a long time. As you can see, they're really dirty. And there's the bucket there. So the fuel line is just tucked down into that bucket, and I'm probably going to have to do a couple, because I know the tank is like 3/4 full, and that's only a 5-gallon bucket. But yeah, in the meantime, while I wait for the fuel, I'm going to go ahead and just start getting the car put back together exterior wise. And I'm going to go ahead and get the axles in it, and I want to try and get my wheels and my suspension on. That way, when the fuel rail gets here, that might be the last thing that I have to do, besides finishing up the wiring for the conversion harness. But I at least want to just get it to run before I go ahead and mess with all that, just to verify that everything is good and the engine's good and all that. But yeah, let's go ahead and get started draining this fuel out. Alright, so this is how I went ahead and got the pump to run. I have just this like back probing wire here. It comes with the alligator clip, and on this end it's a pin. And I have this wire going to the positive on the battery. And then I have this plug undone for the fuel pump. And I'm going to go ahead and put power to, I believe it's a green and yellow wire. Yeah, it's a green and yellow wire. It's the second one. It's thicker gauge than the rest. And then I'm going to put power to it and it should turn on. Alright, so as you can see, I put my positive lead into the terminal for that green and yellow wire. And it's kind of hard to hear on camera, but you can hear the pump on. And do you remember you have to have the key on so it supplies ground, at least I believe you do. And as you can see, it's kind of hard to see, but it's pumping out. Alright, so this is the suspension that I'm getting ready to put on right now. It's Form and Function Type 1. These are used. I got them out of a junkyard a couple years ago and just sat on them until I had a use for them. They didn't seem like they were very old or used that much. They're a little dirty just from sitting, and I never cleaned them when I took them off the car, but this is what I'm going to install and put on, and hopefully it rides pretty nice. But first I'm going to go ahead and get some oil in the transmission. It should take about 2 to 2.5 quarts, somewhere in there. And then I'm going to go ahead and get the axles in and get the suspension on. These are the axles I'm going to use for my K-swap. And what these are these are base model 5-speed RSX axles from like an 02, 04. And I was doing some reading online, and I guess the lengths are wrong. And if you swap the inner joints, the lengths will be right. So I went ahead and swapped the inner joints, and I just put some worm drive clamps on the boots because I don't have the right kind of clamps, but they're solid in there and they should work just fine. I accidentally took the boot off because I was going too fast and I wasn't paying attention, and I took the boot off on this side, or at least took the clamp off. So I just went ahead and put a worm drive clamp right there as well. But I'm going to go ahead and get these thrown in and start getting the suspension and the wheels on. Alright, so I got the RFP ones on, and I got the axles in, and I got the Form and Function Type 1 suspension on. Alright, so I got the front bumper on, and I got the front lip on. And I'm definitely happy with how it came out. I'm going to have the whole front bumper repainted because there's some spots down here on the lip and the bumper that kind of peeled a little. But that's no big deal. I plan on having all the body work touched up once I get the car running. But definitely doesn't look bad. And I also went ahead and got the radiator put in. I figured it'd be easier to do when I have the bumper off. And I basically just made a bracket. It's hard to see, but there's just a bracket that holds the radiator down there. I just used, there's one like a factory nut that's welded onto the bottom of the radiator support, and I just bolted the bracket to that, and I set the radiator in there. It's not permanent, but it works for now, and this thing's solid. It's not going anywhere. And then I just used one of the factory mounts, and I straightened this tab out because this tab originally went inside of here to kind of like dowel it in place. And then I used one of the factory lower radiator bushings that kind of go into these spots down here. I just set it in there so that way it is not just like banging against the frame. But yeah, it's solid, it's in there, it's in a good spot. For the radiator hoses, I just used, I think this one's off of a CRV, a first gen CRV, and I just cut it. And it just routes from right there under the air intake to right here. And for the lower radiator hose, I used the upper Integra radiator hose, and I just went ahead and trimmed it on this end, and then trimmed it on that end, and it just routes up into the thermostat housing. So that ended up being pretty easy. Eventually I'll probably switch this whole setup, but at least to get it on the road, it's gonna go ahead and work for now. So this is the kit right here, and I'll show you guys the part number. That's the part number. And I just got this off eBay. I just looked up K-swap clutch line, and it had this kit, so I figured why not get this kit, because the clutch, the clutch master that I have on the car right now is from an old EG, so I figured, you know what, if it comes with a whole kit and I need the line anyway and I need a slave, just get the whole kit. So this is like looks like a rubberized hose. It's probably a steel cable underneath, the steel hose. And then here is the slave cylinder. So I'll probably end up putting the line on this before I end up sticking it against the firewall, just because there's kind of not a lot of room in there. And I believe this is going to be the line that goes to the actual slave or clutch master, and then I believe this is the line that's going to go to the actual slave, but I'm not 100% sure. I'll have to figure all that out when I get it apart and start putting it together. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and get the slave cylinder on there, and I'll go ahead and go from there. Alright, so I got the clutch line and the slave and the master on, and it's kind of a little bit of excess here, but that's fine. I don't know how I'm going to route it or what I'm going to zip tie it to or however I fasten it down, but for now it works. And it's actually already all bled. I got fluid in it and I bled it. I just put a hose on the end of the bleeder and I just cracked it open, and I had the other end of the hose in a bottle of brake fluid and just pumped the pedal until it was firm. And it actually took a lot of pumping. I was probably pumping for 20 minutes just to get all that air out, but the clutch pedal is bled nice and firm. And I actually also got this completely bolted down, and I got it in a nice spot where when I do some trimming on the center console piece here, I'll be able to get it back in there and make it all look good. And this thing is not going anywhere. This thing is nice and firm. What I did was I used a plate of steel that I had just laying around, had a bunch of holes in it already, and the holes lined up with the factory studs that the shifter originally sat on, and also had holes for that lined up with the actual shift box here. So I just bolted the plate to the floor, and then I bolted this to then I bolted the shifter to the plate, and it worked out pretty good. So I'm pretty happy with that. Alright, so next I'm going to go ahead and install this fuel rail kit. It comes with a fuel rail and regulator and some other stuff I'm not sure yet. I'll show you guys here in a second when I unbox it, and this should be the last thing I need to install, just to at least get it to run. There is a bunch of other stuff I need to button up, but I want to go ahead and get it running just so I can make sure everything else is right in that regard, and then I can go ahead and button up all the other little stuff on the car. Alright, so I got it all unboxed, and it came with quite a bit of components here. It came with the regulator unit, which is this piece here. I screwed one of these fittings in, but it came with the actual regulator unit here, and I assume you got filter in, out to the rail, and then return on the bottom, but I'm not 100% sure. But I guess, you know, we'll hook it up and see if we can't get it to work right, and if we do, then that's the way it's going to be. Then it came with all these fittings here. It came with 3 straight fittings, 3 90-degree fittings. It came with this, which I'm not sure what I'm going to use this for, or what I'm supposed to use this for. And then it came with this, and I assume this is going to go on the end of the return line, so I can hook it back up to the factory return line, which is a rubber hose. Then it comes with the gauge itself, a bunch of little gaskets, a plug, a couple extra plugs, and then the actual rail itself. And it didn't come with very much hose. This is all the hose that it came with, so I might end up having to get more. which sucks because I believe you need this exact style hose, the braided hose for the AN lines, but I'm not 100% sure. Oh, and then it also came with this banjo hardline here, which I already installed, and it's going to sit right here, and I assume one line's supposed to go to the rail on this side and then one's supposed to go over there. I'm not 100% sure. I do know it's supposed to be able to work with the factory fuel filter, but I don't know. I would have thought that it would have been pointing that direction, but I'm not sure. I'm going to go ahead and mess around with everything, and I'll show you guys how I end up setting it all up once I get there.